Hello, everyone, and welcome to NARUC's quarterly peer sharing workforce development webinar on strategic communications and storytelling. I'm Hyleo Quinn. I'm a policy advisor for NARUC's Center for Partnerships and Innovation, which I will provide a brief background on. Next slide, please. Founded in 1889, NARUC is a nonprofit membership association representing state public utility commissions across all 50 states, Washington, D.C., the U.S. Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico. Our mission is to serve in the public interest by improving the quality and effectiveness of public utility regulation. Today, NARUC represents nearly 250 elected and appointed state commissioners and over 1,000 commission staff working across energy, telecommunications, water, and in some states, transportation regulation. Next slide, please. The Center for Partnerships and Innovation, CPI, supports our members through technical assistance, training, working groups, and webinars just like this one. We're grateful for the Department of Energy for funding this and other efforts to strengthen regulatory expertise and collaboration amongst our members. Thank you for your participation today. And I will now hand it over to the Honorable Davante Lewis, Commissioner for the Louisiana Public Service Commission, who will be leading today's discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Aaliyah. And thank you all for joining us today in what I think will be a great conversation about elevating Public Utilities Commission's impacts through storytelling and strategic communications. Today, we're going to explore effective communications and how it can enhance public trust, engagement, and understanding, especially in the regulated utility sector. As many of you know, public utility commissions safeguard access to safe, reliable services that millions of people depend on daily. While regulations established through the framework, clear strategic messaging reinforces our purpose, transparency, and fosters public trust, and highlights the importance of the work that we do. In an era now of rapid information flow, evolving public expectations, storytelling, and strategic messaging are powerful tools to bridging the gap between the technical expertise that so many of our commissions face with public understanding. So today we're going to do a deep dive into some of the best practices for crafting clear and compelling narratives, building public confidence, and navigating communication challenges unique to our energy sector. So I'm going to introduce the three amazing panelists that we have here today. First, we have Kidan Araya, who is a policy and communication strategist with over a decade of experience working in energy, climate, and environmental policy, security, and technology. She has advised senior leaders and staff at the U.S. Department of State and the U.S. Department of Energy communicating complex policy issues on energy and in the environment. She is a participant of the U.S. Department of State's Global Speaking Program and was invited by the EPA to serve as a panelist to the inaugural United States African Leaders Summit to speak to global energy transitions. She serves as a woman leader and energy fellow at the Atlantic Council in D.C. So we want to first thank you for joining us. Next, we have Ashley Bernardi. Ashley is an award-winning podcaster, author, media relations expert, and trainer, and founder and CEO of Nardi Media LLC, a full-service media relation firm that specializes in media placement and training for organizations, authors, thought leaders, entrepreneurs, and so much more. Ashley has served as a network television news producer for nearly a decade, including with her credits, including CBS News, Energy Now, a national syndicated energy and environmental show on Bloomberg TV, and The Washington Post. She has a passion for helping organizations and their leaders grow from zero exposure to household names, including landing authors on the New York Times bestsellers list. And finally, our last panelist is Mary Love. She is the Senior Director of External Communications at the Nuclear Energy Institute, where she's responsible for shaping the external narrative around nuclear energy. With nearly 15 years of experience in communication and public affairs, Mary has worked to shape and advance policy issues through storytelling and communications campaigns. During her time at NEI, Mary has led communication campaigns that have significantly bolstered public support for U.S. nuclear technology and positioned nuclear energy at the forefront of the clean energy transition and energy security. So I want to thank all three of them for joining us today, and I want to thank all of you participants for being here at this webinar. I'm going to start off, we're going to have just a dialogue between the four of us. But audience, as you have any questions, please drop those in the Q&A chat function at any time, and we will address your questions at a later part of this webinar. So let's get started with this discussion. And so I think my first question that I'm going to open up to all the panelists is, what role do you believe storytelling plays in building public trust and stakeholder buy-in, especially in industries like us in nuclear or in utilities in the energy field? And so, Ashley, how about you start us off with that question?
Thank you so much, Commissioner. I smile because it's an important thing that you can do to reach others. And as a former journalist, I can say that storytelling is the number one thing we look for, especially in a guest. And why is that? It's because people listen to stories, people connect with stories, stories have outcomes and lessons, and they're useful. So if you are hoping to connect with your audience, think of a story that you can tell. And oftentimes people say, well, I'm really not sure where to start. And you can start with something that you're proud of within your organization or you're proud of that you do. And I guarantee that's going to lead to something meaningful and likely a story. But again, stories are how people are going to remember you. And they've been told for thousands of years. And it's a practice that if you want to reach more people, that's how you want to start, by telling stories.
No, that's absolutely true. Mary, anything you want to add to that why storytelling is important?
Yeah, I mean, storytelling is so critical, especially in the nuclear industry. It helps build the credibility with your audience. It helps bolster that trust. And, a lot of times people don't really think about what you're doing, right? Nuclear doesn't come to the forefront of your mind. But if you can find a story that really resonates to the people that you're talking to, you start to gain not only that credibility, but you also begin to pick up that brand recognition. And so we find that storytelling, instead of just sharing facts, figures, really helps build that credibility, but also resonates with the people on the other side.
Absolutely. Kidan, anything you want to add to that question?
Yeah, I agree with all the comments. And I think it's so important how storytelling allows you to move beyond data. So I think when you think about different audiences, there's some audiences that might be interested in the data or be interested in some of the policy processes behind it. But when we're talking about the public, and I would argue most key stakeholders, they want to hear about the impact. And I think that's where storytelling really shines, is showing the impact. I have an example of supporting one of my federal clients, and we were talking about like all of the money that was going into making energy bills affordable and for people to install clean energy installations into their house. And they weren't really getting it. Like they could see the money and the data was there, but they're like, how is this actually helping people? And so something that we were able to do is actually source a story, for example, this church in the Midwest who had always wanted to install solar. And then they saw these tax credits come through and they're like, wow, we can finally do what we want to do because this makes it affordable. And that really helped our client be like, okay, this policy is actually making an impact versus just seeing data on a piece of paper. And so that's where I think storytelling can really shine, is showing the real world impact of energy policy.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think storytelling it encompasses, I think, just the pure items of what we have to work for. And so I want to go to this next question because I think as you heard, and this is NARUC, this is the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. And state commissions, we are often needing to explain the long-term benefits of certain policies. Why are we doing a rate increase? Why did we put this type of generation on? Why are we changing a certain rule? Looking at grid modernization or nuclear expansion, and that may be to a skeptical crowd who's not deeply involved in the details and the day to day of the filings that so many of us are. So I'm very curious at what strategies work best that you have or that you have utilized for making these very technical topics that we are dealing with engaging, but most importantly, understandable to the public. And anyone can go first.
Well, I'll jump in first. I mean, I work with engineers, I work with policy wonks, and so we constantly tell them before they're getting in front of people, talk to the audience and who you're engaging with as if you're talking to your grandmother. Is this a conversation you can have at the dinner table and everyone can engage in? So you've got to really get it to a place where we say take it down a level, right? I also think that we are always working to try and make sure that the voice is very authentic, right? So when you have those moments where you need to explain these very technical pieces, when you're in a moment of challenge, you want to make sure that you've established credibility. You want to make sure that the person that's delivering the message is the right messenger. There are instances where we want to make sure that our policy people are upfront because they're speaking to a policy audience. But if we're talking to people about maybe workforce development, we want to make sure that people who are working in the industry are talking to them. So I think that it's really important to make sure that you are speaking on the level of the people in front of you to really help break down those technical pieces. We are always putting out white papers, we have policy priorities, but we don't lead with those papers. We make sure that we are creating content that is easily accessible, whether it's through a blog post. Understanding how your audience consumes information is also really important because it's something that can also perhaps be used in a video format. So understanding how your audience takes information, understanding what level they're at, and creating that credibility with who you're putting out there as the messenger are three things that we really think about.
And no, absolutely. Any Ashley, anything you want to add, or Kidan, anything?
Yeah,
on
I'd
that?
love to. I mean, everything Mary said, and a couple things that I'll share from my perspective as a journalist, because I used to have to work with a lot of policy wonks, experts, stories covering nuclear and solar and wind and carbon capture and storage, things that we as journalists would have to digest and make it understandable to the general public. And so a couple attributes that I can recommend is, first, positive language. When you use positive language, you are essentially managing questions that you're being asked, and people are more likely to understand you when you're using positive language versus negative language. When I say negative language, I mean language such as, or phrases such as, no, I don't know, I can't, we don't, I didn't, because that can cause confusion and also open up the door for potentially negative questions. When you use positive phrases, and I have words that I like to call power words. Power words help you move a conversation forward in a constructive way and to a direction that you want to be talking about. So positive language using power words such as, I'm motivated. We've demonstrated that. It's clear to us that we're excited about. So that can help you move the conversation forward in a way that you're more likely to be understood and remembered. Because when and especially if you're being interviewed by a journalist, you can always count on them to ask a negative question. So it is your job, especially, to figure out how you can flip that to take control of it by using something that I call power words. The other point, and Mary made this point, is keeping it simple. And I love that Mary says, explain it as if you're explaining it to your grandma, because I say explain it as if you're explaining it to your middle schooler. So like take those two and have that be your starting places. Because, and when I say this, you're all experts on a very complicated subject, and your audience likely isn't. So even acronyms, this was a big thing when I was a producer, acronyms, and I'm in the DC region, so everything is an acronym here. But for the general public, it does not compute. It does not digest. As an example, just earlier today, I was talking to a colleague. I'm in the DMV. She didn't even know what that meant. DMV, District, Maryland, Virginia. She's in Los Angeles, right? We cannot assume. I had made that silly mistake and assumed that my colleague knew what DMV meant. So we just can't assume that people know, which is why you want to keep it as simple as possible. I'll stop there because I'm sure there's other thoughts here, but those are my two big pointers.
No, I mean, thank you so much, Ashley. And anybody who knows the utility regulated space knows we have an acronym for acronyms on acronyms. So I think that is a very good point for us. Kidan, anything you want to add about why and how we should talk about these long term benefits for certain policies?
Yeah, I think a lot of these points that were just made, that's the strategy you need to go with. But I think a key thing that I feel like is left out of the conversation that people need to consider is how immersive you can make the experience of communicating your topic. Because, like you just said, there's so many things that energy utilities companies are doing or commissions that are long term. And so if you're talking to people about that, they can't necessarily see now, for example, what that impact will be. And I have a really interesting story where I was at the climate conference, International Climate Conference, and there was actually a vendor there that had AR, VR, so augmented reality, virtual reality headsets that people could put on and actually see, for example, how plastic pollution was harming coral reefs. And I feel like that's something that you hear about, right? And you're like, that's so horrible. But this company was allowing people to actually experience that, where I tried it as well, where you feel like you're underwater and you see the damage that's being done. And that was a few years ago, but wow, I still remember that experience, right? Because it was immersive. And so I understand maybe not everyone has the budget for AR VR headsets and things like that, but I think it sets a good story of how to make the storytelling or the communications that you do as engaging or immersive as possible. So I think we mentioned like infographics and graphics and videos online. Like there's the storytelling part of that, but how can you make it like actionable? So, at the end of that video, is there an action that people can take? Or I've seen, in certain webinars where people will have like survey questions, throughout the webinar, where it allows people to just kind of pause for a moment, digest that information, and really react in real time to kind of what you're communicating. And so I think that's the power, especially of having those immersive experiences, that you can show people what the kind of projected impact or outcome is of a policy. So imagine like installing, some sort of regulations to prevent or help prevent wildfires, right? You can actually show people in a headset, for example, okay, this is what it's like to install that. This is what we think will happen if in this scenario, by implementing this technology, we can hopefully, prevent wildfires in this way. So it just kind of brings that extra kick. And I think we all know it's so hard to grab people's attention these days. So it's kind of something, and I know like for me, I was in that busy conference, and when they were like, try a headset, I was like, okay, I'm so busy, but I'll try it. So it's just it's another tool to think about and bringing that new tech into how we're communicating.
No, I
You know,
think, yeah, go ahead, Mary, go, please.
well, I love what you're saying because I think an immersive experience, is helpful in creating those emotions. So I always say the best stories where I'm most influenced is when I leave with an emotion, and I don't think you always get that when you're reading a blog post. If you're listening to someone just tell you, kind of talk at you, but those immersive experiences create an emotional appeal, and I think that's really important to storytelling.
Yeah, I think Kiran and Mary, what you bring up is so brilliant, and I can speak to this as a former TV producer because we are visual storytellers. And so it is so often that if we want to reach the people we want to reach, which is our audience and oftentimes the general audience, what are we going to see in addition to who we're going to hear speak? And Mary has heard me talk about this a lot. Visuals, what are we going to see? What are we going to see? It doesn't need to be just an immersive experience. It can also just be photos or B-roll, which is just video. How can you tell that story? Or perhaps there are even, and this is something else that we look at as another element in the TV world, are those real people, the humans, like the people who are impacted by the incredible work that you do. Get some video of them talking on camera, walking and talking, maybe showing some different shots. That is another very powerful element of storytelling or the visuals. So whether it's immersive, whether it's a still photo, whether it's a video, and thankfully we all have phones these days, we can shoot something very nicely from a phone. There is always an opportunity for it, I believe, but it is a very powerful, we call it in TV, element to supplement having someone share their message.
No, I find this all to be so helpful and gives a good context of how we can actually use communication to our advantage. I know here in Louisiana, in my commission, I've tried to adopt some of these strategies. My office, we have a TikTok, and we've like walked people through their bills, because one of the most questions we always get is, I don't understand my bill. So we're using that, and we saw so much different engagement from people when we kind of were visually going line by line, saying this is what this meant, this is what that meant. And that engagement's different. And so this kind of takes me to my next question about what role do you believe community engagement plays in energy communication, and how can organizations, commissions, utilities foster more meaning dialogue with the communities they serve to make those connections that y'all just talked about?
I can take this one first. I think we just talked about with storytelling, but I mean, showing up to events and having conversations is really important. I think, like we said, as much as, we all work hard to make sure that people are reading our reports and blogs and videos and, securing that press coverage, not everyone is going to have the time or accessibility to, access those resources that we have and read them online. But when you actually say, I'm going to come to you, that builds so much trust and respect in your stakeholders. So like going to events that they're hosting, I think a lot of times in the energy space, like we're holding so many, hearings and things like that. But what if we actually take time to go to, a farmer's market and, have a vending booth where we talk to people about, kind of what you mentioned, how to read your energy bill, for example, like that goes a long way. Or, for example, in stakeholder engagement, like a lot of times we'll have, invitations from people, from unions, from non-governmental organizations, even, for example, like senators who are like, my constituents have questions. Can you come and talk to them about it? It just means so much when you show up and are willing to hear what people have to say and concerns live, because I think it's so much more impactful when you actually go in person and are willing to hear people's questions on their terms than, in your report saying, we engage stakeholders. That's true. We need to say that, but it's just so much more powerful when you show up in person. And I think that's why it's so, critical, I think, for so many energy leaders to get really comfortable with public speaking, because people want to hear from you. They want to hear directly from different energy leaders, like, how is this policy going to affect me, how is this going to improve my life? And so having that power of public voice and communicating that's going to go, I think, even a longer way than someone just reading about something that you said would happen with your policy.
Yeah, I'll say from my stand with the nuclear industry, we are in the process right now of talking about building new nuclear reactors in communities that have never had them before. And so we're taking some new approaches to try and make sure that we're showing up early, not only to communicate with the local community there, but we're having opportunities to listen as well, to help us understand exactly where we need to show up and the conversations that we should be having instead of dictating those conversations. So listening first is a big part of what we're doing with that community engagement. We're also we're holding office hours, we're holding some picnics. To your point, Kidan, bringing the communities together through some of these events. We're also working to make sure that if there's something to see, if there's site tours, that always is helpful for people to see what you're talking about. It helps break down some transparency as well. And I'll say at NEI, we've put together a new working group to make sure that we are putting together those materials. Our members are asking us, what can you do to help us communicate better? And so we're putting together materials, offering places on our website to make sure that we're getting directly to the questions that are being asked, but we've got to start by listening first.
Totally agree. And from a journalism perspective too, boots on the ground. I mean, there is more emphasis now in the media of community engagement more than ever before. I was at a TV studio this morning and they're like, please tag us, please this, please this. They want to see your engagement, and they look for that from their audience too. And it's the same thing. So get your boots on the ground. And I know we're going to discuss this, Commissioner, but I think also before you get your boots on the ground, know what you're going to say. And that's where I recommend a simple communication statement, which is your main message made without jargon so that anybody can understand it. It's positive in tone and content. content, it's story-like, and it's 30 to 60 seconds long, right? So you want to have when you go into these, picnics or events or just getting out in the community, you have to know what it is, the main message that you want to get across to everybody that you speak to. And you want it to have those three important attributes: positive in tone and content, story-like, 30 to 60 seconds long. And repetition is the key to retention. That is how you will get everyone to engage. So yes, listen, Mary brought up such an excellent point. As communicators, one of our greatest assets is listening and then reflecting back and also sharing your message in a way that people can understand. So get your boots on the ground, yes, and know what you're going to say before you do. Practice it out loud also before you get out there, because the way we write and the way we speak are two very different things.
No, I think that's so important, actually, to focus on it. That, I mean, in this field, a lot of stuff is written communication, and so how do we cross apply that when we are not in the technical written form? And so I guess this kind of takes me to a question that I wanted to get to, but I think this is a perfect time. So what are those common communication pitfalls when addressing public concern or presenting information, and how should we avoid those pitfalls? So actually, I already heard you say that know what you want to say and do it. But are there any other pitfalls that we should look out for when we're drafting communication plans?
It's the negative language. So watch out for that, because that can cause message confusion and can lead folks down a path where it opens up the door for negative follow-up questions. So even thinking about, well, I'm not the expert. I've heard this on, like, I'll tell a story to drive the point home. I once had booked an expert on Bloomberg Radio, and he was a U.S. China, like, economic expert going on to talk, economic expert to talk about U.S.-China relations. Great, perfect person for it. Reporter asked him the question. The first answer out of his mouth was, well, I'm not the expert. What do you think that does? That diffuses the interview, that diffuses his credibility. So you really, I mean, I can't stress enough how important it is to eliminate that negative language, and in order to reach more people, replace it with positive language. So another thing, a pitfall is, what if you get asked a question that you don't know the answer to, or you don't want to answer, or it's a question that might infuriate you? There's a technique that I teach in media training called blocking and bridging, and it's essentially blocking that question that's being asked by bridging into another topic. Because what if you're caught as a deer in the headlights? Oh God, I don't know. I'm not. You can always refer somebody else. You can say, you know what, let me check with my office and I'll get back to you. But this technique also helps you take control of that question and bring it back to what you want to be talking about using appropriate bridging language. So that could be something like, the critical issue is, well, thank you so much for that question. Here's another way to think about it. Our goal here is you essentially just take that question and block it by bridging to what you want to talk about using key bridging language. Now, I say, if you can answer the question, absolutely, you should always answer it. But a common pitfall is people get frozen. They don't know what to say. They might look stunned or they get nervous, right? So having a technique in your back pocket like blocking and bridging is a great way to help take control of a conversation and bring it back to what you want to be talking about, which should be your simple communication statement.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much. Any other pitfalls, Mary or Kidan, that you think my colleagues should be aware of?
Well, I always say it's being proactive in communicating. If you are waiting to communicate when the challenge or the crisis hits, you're too late. If you're not telling your story, then someone else is telling the story for you, and it may not be the story you want. So always continuing to be proactive in where you stand, or making sure you have always on content. And what do I mean by that? Well, that's making sure that you're showing up on social media if that's where your constituents are at, just to make sure that you're continuing to Ash's point earlier, repetition is key. Do you show up on social media? Are you writing blogs? Are you connecting with local television producers to make sure you get on television? Are you showing up at those key events that Kidan was talking about? It is so important that you continually be proactive. You should never get comfortable and say, okay, I've done all of these things, because you want to stay at the forefront of people's minds. We have a lot of buzz out there. And so again, being authentic, creating stories that resonate with the audience will keep you memorable, but also making sure that you stay relevant.
No, that is great advice. Kidan.
Yeah, I think all of that is great. And also, I think it's important to be consistent. And I think also a huge pitfall is not like taking note when something is not working. So not being afraid to kind of switch it up a bit. Because I see often with a lot of my clients, a lot of this, we have to put out, press releases and things like that. Like we have to make sure that we're putting out, public records. But then there's sometimes where they're thinking that people are going to engage in a certain way. And maybe it's like a few weeks go by or a few months go by and no one's really engaging. And instead of kind of using that as an opportunity to like regroup, like, well, let's just keep, going at it. And I think a huge pitfall is like doing that, because at the end of the day, like we're creating energy policy because we want this to positively impact people's lives. So if you are not getting a positive response from people, or people are not really engaging with it, it's time to like really sit down and have a refresh of like, is how can we make this more accessible? Is there something, is there a place that we need to go? Like maybe we're using our website. Do we need to go to TV, as was mentioned, or do we need to go to, those community events as mentioned? So really like sitting by, because I'm sure we've all seen a lot of like social media web pages where it's like all negative comments from people. And I think that stems from frustration, right? Because they feel like there's no other space that they can voice their concerns. And so they're just going to leave negative comments on, your Instagram or something because they don't feel heard. And so I think if, an organization is experiencing a lot of that, that's one sign that maybe the communication strategy needs to have a refresh and figuring out like what will really reach people in a way that's going to be productive for all parties.
I'm
No,
glad
that
you said that. Oh, go ahead.
no, Mary, please.
No, I'm glad you said that because I feel like sometimes it's like write the press release and you send the press release and you wonder why didn't anyone pick it up? And or there's an appetite to write it and there's an expectation that okay, you've sent the press release out, so that means it's going to be front page news. But to your point, there's so many different ways to get your story out there. And so not being afraid to say, okay, it's not the press release, let's move to something else, I think is a really good point. That's excellent.
Yeah, and to that point, also, again, coming from the journalist standpoint, when we were pitched so many different energy and environmental stories, we would always ask ourselves, why should my audience care about this, right? There's all these like high level announcements and jargon and press releases. I've seen all the press releases in the world. But if it's not telling me why my audience should care, I'm not going to connect with it. And so one really good starting point in just communicating in general is, okay, why should my audience care, right? Why should the people that I'm speaking to care about this? How are their lives going to be directly impacted? This was truly a task that my executive producer tasked me with every single story that I would be working on. Okay, Ashley, you got to go make people care about George Washington's birth home being converted to geothermal energy, right? What's in it for the viewer? What's in it for your audience? And that's a great starting place to think about if you ever need to redirect or think of a different strategy.
No, that this is also helpful, and I think that really takes us to kind of the next question about strategies and how we implement it. So the energy sector is no stranger to crises that arise, whether it is a power outage, whether it's a safety issue from a gas or water company, whether it's a regulatory challenge and increasing rates. I'm in Louisiana, whether it's a natural disaster, right? So how does strategic communication play a role in maintaining credibility when all eyes are on you, right? Because I know from some of my utilities, they are more reserved because they're like, if we give too much information, we may make people mad. But then you have on the flip side, people are calling us saying, "I know nothing." So what's some advice you would give to us commissioners who are kind of in the middle sometimes during a crisis, or to a utility who is the direct one responsible for responding or maintaining to crises, and what should that strategic communication plan look like?
Well, I will say, I'll go back to my last point, which is it's important that you're already communicating before the crisis comes
Right.
up. So that actually helps build the credibility and makes you a relevant voice in the conversation. And if you jump in during the crisis and that's the first time you're engaging, why would anyone want to come to you and talk to you first, right? Why would they believe you? So I think that's very important. That's why we should be communicating all the time. I also think being very authentic and making sure it's the right messenger, right? You may be in the middle of the crisis, but are you really the right messenger? Do you have experts or other organizations or third parties that can speak to the issue? That is I think that is really hard once you get out there and you claim to be an expert or you claim to be able to speak on something and then you get out there and you can't do it. So I would say lean on third parties, make sure you're the right messenger, and make sure that you have information up that is very timely, right? So I'm thinking about when Russia invaded Ukraine, we got a lot of questions about those nuclear power plants. And so the first thing we did is we created a page on our website. We couldn't answer all the questions, right? So we put resources of people they could talk to. We put up some information about nuclear plants and safety because we understood that people here in the US also had concerns. And so we made sure that we had the information out as quickly as possible. We put it on the homepage because we wanted people to be able to find it. And we made sure we had credible voices on that website that people could turn to.
And Mary, I echo all of that. And something else I've seen organizations do is have a plan, have a crisis plan in place. I've been working on crisis messaging for an organization for different scenarios, and it's just to be ready. And it's not like they would necessarily use that exact messaging, but if scenario A, B, C, or D happened, we have some sort of language in place that is consistent with the main message that it has been for several years now. So we're not left scrambling. Oh my gosh, what do we say? You get a microphone thrown in your face. What do we do? Right? And to Mary's point, you want to get out there quickly if there's a crisis, and you should be talking to them before. And if there's a crisis, have some sort of language and plan in place that you can build on and cater it to that specific crisis.
Yeah, these are such great points. I think to add as well, kind of back to what we are talking about with tech, there's so much emerging tech out here, especially in like the age of generative AI and things like that. And so making sure that during crises, you're actually tailoring your message, because people can tell the difference between just like a kind of a copy and paste, or maybe we've seen this response before. And I've even seen with some of my clients, like some people will be like, wait, is this AI? Because it just feels like they've already seen it before. And you don't want to get those types of accusations. So making sure in crisis, like you're really tailoring your messages to the concerns that are current. So not just kind of like those copy and paste of like, we see the situation and we're acting now or something like that, but really like we understand the concerns and whatever that might be, whether that's like a climate or event that you're referring to, or some sort of power outage, things like that, like making sure that your communication speaks to the moment and is not just generic messaging. And I think as well, it's really important, as like Mary's talking about, to have that authentic voice and just being consistent, because you don't want to be in a situation where you're always kind of on defense, where I think there's organizations where like they only come out when something bad happens or they have to defend themselves. Like that's just not, you're kind of starting off at a deficit when it comes to like building trust among people, especially during a crisis. And you want to be seen as like trusted, data-driven, reliable source of information long before something happens. So I really just echo that about like just being consistent, so that people already know that you're someone to go to. And there's actually an organization I worked with where they're like, we're really tired of seeing all this disinformation that comes out about like energy outages and things like that. And so we actually worked to develop like a myth busting sheet. So even though that's not like, you're gonna have to tailor that or your messaging whenever something happens, but kind of that using that myth busting as a strategy to like get ahead a bit of the situations, so that when something goes down, they at least have that resource to see, okay, like these are like some myths and truths about what happens during a power outage, or what are utilities roles in that. And so that kind of helps a bit, that you're not like always starting, I would say step one with getting people to understand kind of your role in a crisis. Because I think I've also hear, and I work with a lot of scientists who like get really frustrated with the amount of disinformation that's out there. But I think one thing about it is that a lot of disinformation is really abundant, unfortunately. So it's like if someone sees like a 2-minute reading time press release on your website, kind of fact busting, versus a hour YouTube video about what's happening that's full of disinformation, a lot of people are just going to click on the YouTube video because it's more engaging. And so it's it's about like kind of back to what we're saying, making sure you have quality types of, resources. So like myth busting or, other different types of resources you have on your website so that people are not just like, well, we can't really rely on them for the communications anyway. So we're just going to go on, whatever source because they're actually giving us something more than what, maybe some of the more reputable organizations should be doing.
No, I think that is great advice to think about, especially as we kind of are in an energy transition. I mean, trying to explain these complex changes that utilities are taking on, the industry is taking on. I think that that's kind of a very important message. I still want to remind our audience that if you have questions, you can drop them in the Q&A function of the webinar. And so I'm going to go and look. So we have a question here that I think is really important. Public utility commissioners, we are a quasi judicial agency, and because of that, we see that the agencies take a very cautious approach to communication, often limiting messages to legal findings that are difficult for the average person to understand. Also, commissioners are often avoiding interviews, are deferring to defense legal language, which creates a disconnect between the commission's work and the public's ability to engage with it. What advice would you give, and how can we help our commissioners understand the importance of using clearer, more relatable language and storytelling while maintaining their quasi-judicial role and neutrality?
I think it's a big question. The one thing I will say is this kind of goes back to the point everyone has made, is that like you don't want the first time that your spokesperson is out speaking is during a crisis. And so step one is potentially having your folks media trained and prepared for interviews. So you learn how to speak in simple language that is safe. And across the board, anyone can understand it. So whether it's somebody who is highly technical, judicial, or a customer, or just a general member of the public, I think that it's very important to have some sort of training of learning how to verbally communicate what you want to say, because as I said earlier, the way we write and the way we speak are two very different things. So I think step one is getting trained for different scenarios, and then also honing in on that main message, right? We all have that like, why? Okay, why are we going to go out and do this interview? We have this really great announcement, not a crisis, but we have a great announcement. You don't want to hold that back. So step one is disseminate it so that it is relatable and understandable to the general public. Step two is now practice saying your message out loud and then go share it, whether it's on TV or with the general public or on social media. But that would be my step-by-step process for a very important and in-depth question.
I will say also, this may be more about working with your commissioner, but we often try to find examples for our executives of really good interviews and storytelling that really brings credibility and voice without perhaps taking like harsh stances. We also ask our executives to think about people that they really like to, the people that they admire, who they listen to, and they still they view them as a credible source. Like we are asking them to think about examples and apply it to their own lives. And I think that that is helpful, and at least it's been helpful for, as she knows, our CEO to be able to give relative, like real examples of how it's worked by people that they admire and have them start to learn that way.
Yeah, I think all those are such great tips. And I think, there's sometimes a nuance between, okay, well, we need to be really technical or evidence-based versus being engaging. And I would say like those don't have to be like two separate things, right? And so I really like to do like stakeholder mapping. And so doing research for my client on like what messages resonate with stakeholders, because when you have that information and that's evidence and there's research around that and you present it to them, I feel like it kind of it can be motivating enough to be like, okay, well, this actually is proven to work with the stakeholder. And at the end of the day, as much as we're communicating on complex energy policy topics, we need to have these stakeholders, have buy-in with what we're doing. And so if this message is proven to have resonated with a stakeholder, such as a union or such as a community organization, I feel like they would be more likely to use that when it's, coming from that sort of evidence as well. So I think that's one tactic, as well as just like layering messages too. So, you don't have to go away from, like we said, those like core technical messages, but like using that kind of like tailoring process to like go, allow yourself to go deeper so that you can meet people where they're at, when you're communicating. I don't think you have to be, you don't have to be like a different personality. I like that point on like finding people that, that leaders respect or that leaders are familiar within this field and see how they talk about issues, and kind of that helps leaders to say, okay, I can loosen up more. But I think at the end of the day, like the facts speaks for themselves, that stakeholders are going to respond better when they're being talked to in a way that works for them. So if there's any like research or evidence that you can find of that, even looking at, I know, yeah, people are very chatty. So there's, even looking at like criticisms online, like how have we been criticized in the past? And like, how can we address that in future kind of communications to stakeholders? I think that's helpful too, and helping to be persuasive to people to kind of change things up a bit without, without throwing out the technical, evidence-based type of communications language that sometimes we have to use.
No, I think that's, oh, go ahead, please.
Kidan, it actually made me think of two other things in building your message and sharing it that I don't think I've shared yet. Is the first one is like, remember, communicating is like a human thing. So showing empathy, like being able to relate to another's situation, whether it could be, the struggles of, the general public that perhaps you're trying to solve. But just remember that like using empathy can make you more human and less robotic. And when you do use empathy as an example, like I know how hard it, like, okay, I'm a mom of 3 kids. Like I know how hard it can be as a working mom of 3 kids to do X, Y, Z, whatever you want to say. But getting on their level to relate to them is going to help you connect more. And then the second piece of that is your credibility. So, Commissioner shared our bios in the very beginning, not to be like, oh, look how amazing they are. It's like, hey, that builds trust and rapport. That's why you can trust Kidan, Mary, and myself as communicators, because we've said, Ashley Bernardi, she spent a decade in journalism before crossing over to PR, right? So I've been a commissioner for XYZ years. I've seen this. I've been boots on the ground. In the same way, we say Maria Korsnick, she has been an engineer. She has been inside those nuclear plants as an engineer for nearly 30 years. And when she goes on media interviews, she says that. She says that as a way to build trust and credibility and rapport with the people that she's trying to reach. So I think that's something else that's a really great way to help drive your message home and connect with the people that you want to connect with.
No, I think you're absolutely right, Ashley, and I will tell the questioner as a commissioner. One thing I always remind myself is that explaining doesn't mean I am being biased. And so there's a way that I can talk and explain what an application is, what the docket proceeding is, where I'm not actually opining an opinion. And so there's a way of engaging, right? That can happen. That is like, here, I'm just here to tell you what we're looking at, what we are talking about, but in a way that kind of protects our judicial neutrality and not making us showcase bias or favorable mention to the application or whatever may be for the commission. So there's a good balance that you can do, because explaining doesn't mean you're not being neutral. I'm going to go to another audience question that I think is kind of very similar. And there is the question is, there's a sense here that organizations should be constantly communicating positive messages. Can organizations gain credibility by communicating proactively about challenges they face and hard choices that they have? Or is it only telling uncomplicated good stories that you would recommend?
I chuckle because that's a really great question, and that's something that we also have to discuss internally. There's always some concern about going out front in front of hard issues, but like I said earlier, if you're not out there telling the story, even around your challenges and the things that could be more controversial, someone else is out there telling that story. And it's maybe not the story that you want to be telling. So the way that we address some of the more challenging issues is we are educating people, right? We're not going and saying, hey, you have this question, here's our answer. We're continuing to make content that speaks to those issues, and we're serving it to people, whether it's through videos, our Ask the Expert videos, where we have an expert sit down and answer those hard questions, whether it's about waste, whether it's about positions we're taking on certain policies. It's a way to get out in front and have something to point back to when those hard questions come up. And you're being proactive. You're telling your story, you're getting out there before someone else can tell that for you. So I think it's really important that you're not just telling the good stories, you're not just talking when things are good, you are continuing to talk about the issues that may be more controversial in a way that is educating people and giving you an opportunity to get in front of any of those moments that are going to be really challenging. It's very important.
Yeah, and that kind of reminds me of even back to the last question, but yeah, sometimes, yeah, there's tough questions that maybe our organizations can't necessarily directly address, but as Mary said, through education, that can be done. And I know for me, like I've, participated in panels or been invited to speak by organizations where like maybe, yeah, they were kind of the more technical voice. So they're like, let's invite experts to come and talk about this issue and have a dialogue and invite our stakeholders. And so you kind of have these independent, people who are maybe getting to, say a bit more about the challenges and the realities, and then having that event space where, your stakeholders, constituents can come and ask questions, and having that be provided by the organization. Sometimes that's even more powerful than, directly addressing things, because people really appreciate that learning experience and that event that you gave them. And I can think of so many times where, I've like even supported other leaders in their public speaking engagements, and people, email us after like, thanks for, being there and answering questions, because, we don't always know how to answer on behalf of, this policy, for example, but you actually showing up and like taking some of that tough Q&A in person, that A, helps, build trust, and then B, actually helps us to be speaking more accurately on your issues in the future. And so I always think of like public speaking and going to events and things like that almost as like an act of diplomacy, because you don't want to just go to public speaking events and then like say what you have to say, but you're hoping by the end of it, like you've got, more partners on your side and more, potential stakeholders and more conversations. And so I think that's a good kind of balance. Like if you just, you're at an organization, you kind of just get the no on like talking directly about, like really complicated or controversial issues. Sometimes having those events where, trusted experts can kind of do that for you is also a strategy.
And I can speak to this as a former member of the media, but Kidan and Mary both brought this up, is education. So like we're here to educate our viewers. I want to know what I'm going to learn. And if that means talking about challenges in the industry in a way that does, like when I say positive versus negative language, I say I meant phrases. So no, I don't know, I can't. If you need to talk about and want to address challenges, that is fine. But and I think one way that you can do it is to do it as a way to educate the public. So when I would be pitched guests all the time, hundreds of thousands of guests every day, like millions and millions of pitch emails, what I would look for is, what am I going to learn? What are my viewers going to learn? What is the audience going to learn? Not only what do they care about, but what are we going to learn here, and what are the key takeaways that we're going to educate them? So I think it's a great point that both Mary and Kidan brought up, and I can just validate that as a former member of the press.
I'll say one more thing, and I think Ashley and Kidan have both underscored this. If you're willing to show up and answer the hard questions right there, that gives you credibility. If you're only showing up when you know it's going to be easy, then you are telling people you have something to hide or you don't want to answer the questions. So we had our VP of policy go on NPR, a local NPR station, and it was 45 minutes, maybe it was an hour of questions from the community. And I think they were tough questions, but it gave us credibility that we're willing to come forward and enter those conversations.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that is the step one. I mean, I always joke with my colleagues, I have it a little bit harder because unlike unlike some commissioners, we're elected here in Louisiana. So if I'm not showing up for those community events, I won't be a commissioner much longer. But that's why I think we find communication to be so important, because that is a portion of the job that sometimes they don't think we truly think about. Well, I think we have unfortunately run out of time. This has been an amazing conversation, a lot of food for thought, a lot of creative and innovative ways that I think commissions, commissioners, utilities can take back, that don't fundamentally change what we've done, but make it more engaging for communities and more strategic communication. So I want to thank, first of all, you, Ashley, Mary, and Kidan, for joining us today in this webinar, and being those experts with that credibility to talk about communication and storytelling. I want to encourage all of you who were on this call to apply what you heard, to make all of the complex information that we deal with every day more accessible, reinforce the purpose behind the work that we are all doing, and build stronger connections with the community that we know we are all here to serve. So on behalf of NARIC and myself, I appreciate your time and participation today, and a huge thank you once again to our speakers for sharing their insights and valuable guidance. I am now going to pass it back to NARIC, who will give you some upcoming events that you may be interested of, and close us out on today's webinar.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. And thank you to our three amazing panelists. This was such a great conversation. I've learned a lot personally, and I'm very appreciative for your time today. So the next upcoming webinars that we have an advanced nuclear state collaborative webinar coming up tomorrow, electricity committee call on AI innovation, also tomorrow at 2 p.m. Next week, the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory is hosting a grid resilience planning for wildfires technical training. That will be next Thursday on the 27th. And then there's a gas task force virtual workshop on the 24th through the 26th. So next Monday through Wednesday. Note that the webinars and events that have the asterisk next to them are member only. If you need some more information, do not hesitate to reach out to me or Jessica about it. And then we do have a couple of upcoming in-person events. We have a nuclear site visit happening on April 14th. We have distribution system planning and electrification training happening April 30th through May 1st in Denver. The INSEP annual meeting is still on, and it is slated for September 30th through October 1st, location to be determined. So look out on our website or NARUC's LinkedIn for more information as that comes along. And then we do have a cybersecurity training planned as well in October, the 15th through the 17th, located in Nashville, Tennessee. As just echoing the sentiments of Commissioner Lewis, for your attendance today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.